Thank you very much, Wendy. And I would like to say first a very huge thanks to the Humanitarian Practice Network for publishing this paper on behalf of the Conflict Sensitivity Consortium. And I think just to note that actually the Humanitarian Practice Network is a fantastic resource for all of us as NGOs. This paper will go out to 6,000 people electronically with 2,500 copies. That's the reach our own individual agencies couldn't have achieved. So I think that's a really useful resource for us. So thanks very much for that, Wendy. What I'm going to do now is just really to walk you through the report, to talk about the objectives, the methodology, the findings and the recommendations, so that everybody has a sort of common understanding and an idea, an outline of what the findings and recommendations were, so that we can have some discussion, hopefully, on what your views and how you would see this applicable to your own agencies and experience. Firstly, in terms of the objectives for the review, I guess there's three major objectives. We wanted to look at what are the background, what are the tools, standards and resources that NGOs operate using. So how conflict sensitive are they, and how does that help our work? Then moving on from that, from the very general, to then look at actually what are we doing as agencies? How do we have standards? Do we have guidelines? How conflict sensitive are they? And how are we actually applying them as practitioners? And then out of that research to think about, do we need to strengthen our conflict sensitive approaches in emergency response? And is this a priority for the sector? And if so, what do we need to do to get there? So in terms of the methodology, we looked at the sector tools, including Sphere, Good Enough Guide, the HAP accountability project standards. Then we looked at the tools within each of the 5 focus agencies, the international agencies. And then we looked at 3 case studies. So 2 large-scale emergencies, Haiti and Pakistan, but also Sri Lanka as actually being much more representative of the kind of emergencies that NGOs respond to. Most of our emergencies, although the big ones hit the headlines, they're not the bread and butter of our work. They're the floods that put people in crisis, but that don't make the international headlines. And obviously there are different dynamics and different challenges in those types of emergencies. So just to put up there a definition of what the conflict consortium, conflict sensitivity consortium, defines as conflict sensitivity. So it's understanding the context of where we operate, understanding what is the interaction, what's the impact of our programs, our interventions on the conflict, on the dynamics where we operate. And then thirdly, acting to understand those interactions, and not only to avoid negative impacts, but to maximise positive impacts. So in terms of looking at the findings and the research, we found that the Sphere Charter and standards are implicitly conflict sensitive, although don't mention conflict sensitivity per se. And that the tools are very varied, so the technical standards. So for example, food and nutrition standards mention conflict sensitivity on a number of occasions and give very clear guidance to practitioners. Whereas some of the other technical standards, for example, WASH, appear to be oblivious. In terms of accountability, the Good Enough Guide and the Humanitarian Accountability Project standards are certainly very clearly a vehicle for conflict-sensitive practice. We found that in terms of guidance within agencies, this is fairly varied. Some agencies have very good emergency manuals with conflict-sensitive approaches written into them, clear guidance. Others are just beginning to think about this. But even where these standards and guidance do exist in the emergencies manuals, the huge challenge is the operationalisation of that. And I look around the room and I can see many people here that I know are emergency practitioners, and we all know the pressure that we and our colleagues are under. And so we have to look for ways of making conflict sensitivity appropriate and doable. And this was very much in the backs of our minds in doing this research, and it was certainly borne out in terms of the findings. Nevertheless, it's true to say that the practitioners that we consulted overwhelmingly felt that this was an important issue, and could overwhelmingly cite examples of where conflict sensitivity was not taken into account, and where emergency responses were exacerbated and worsened conflict. We also found that there was widespread support for taking this forward, but that it should be at a minimalist approach. So it should not be in terms of looking at through a wider lens in terms of peace building, but that it should be very much focused on how do we keep our emergency responses conflict sensitive. In terms of the case studies, one of the three countries where where we did the case study in Sri Lanka had been part of the conflict sensitive consortium, and this is a country where NGOs operate in a conflict situation where there's a lot of conflict sensitivity, a lot of conflict awareness. And we found in Sri Lanka that the consortium agencies had taken conflict into account and were using conflict-sensitive tools, whereas in the case of Haiti and Pakistan, although there were implicit conflict sensitivity taken into account in some of the programming, it was not done at an agency level, so there were no conflict advisors brought in, and senior managers did not explicitly ask their staff to take into account their agency frameworks. Of course, as would be expected, we found that a number of the conflict flashpoints were ones that one might expect, for example, targeting, distribution, gender relations, and staffing. Surge capacity is a huge issue. And when, particularly in Haiti, when a lot of international staff came in who didn't understand the context, this caused major problems with their national colleagues. We saw that also in Pakistan, where Sindh was the primary area of the floods for many NGOs, a new area. They brought in staff from other provinces who had emergency response experience but didn't understand the conflict dynamics that were going on at that level. The other flashpoint, this I'm sure will resonate with many of you, is the lack of interagency coordination. So different agencies, one distributing, for example, packages of food relief per household, another distributing it per number of people in the household. So different packages then causing resentment for the community, and a lack of coordination between the agencies, but also inability to communicate that with the beneficiary population, causing huge tensions. I want to go on, as Wendy's flashing to me to wind up.
Sorry, Annie. Yeah, and I'll just say, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
sorry, we had more people than we expected, so we're just opening these doors so that the rest of you who are standing will be able to sit down. So just bear with us, and sorry about the distraction, Anne.
that's okay. Okay, to go on to talk a little bit about some of the key conclusions and recommendations, because I think that's you can read the examples of how the emergencies were exacerbated by lack of conflict sensitivity, but I think sharing the recommendations is really useful now. So it would be fair to say that there's a widespread recognition of the need to better integrate conflict sensitivity into humanitarian response, but to say that, you know, we're not starting from scratch. There are tools, there are standards, there are approaches. Many NGOs are taking this forward, are beginning to think about it. But we need to think and strategize about very practical steps, and how we also train and build awareness within our staff and within our partners' capabilities. And then in terms of the recommendations fall into four broad areas, and I suppose primarily it's about one of the main recommendations is that agencies need to institutionalise their commitment to conflict sensitivity. Then we propose a set of 6 minimum standards for NGOs in terms of integrating conflict sensitivity into emergency response. And we've also devised a set of practical pointers to operationalise conflict sensitivity within the humanitarian programme cycles, so from needs assessment, design, implementation, right the way through. And then finally, looking more broadly, there's certainly a need to raise awareness of conflict sensitive approaches to the humanitarian system as a whole. So looking, for example, at the clusters and how they might move beyond information sharing to actually take on board some of the conflict sensitive issues. And certainly within the consortium there are agencies who play lead roles in some of the clusters. And then, for example, including conflict benchmarks in real-time evaluations. So I'll end by putting up that list of minimum standards, and perhaps we could keep that up there, Wendy, for the discussion.
Sure.
And just to say that one of the things we've sort of cribbed from the Emergency Capacity Building Project, ECB, is this idea of good enough. So a good enough conflict analysis, because we recognise that we're not going to have time in the emergency response to do huge conflict analysis, but something very small, very practical, half a day with a few key staff and partners. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Anne, thanks very much.